Hello and welcome. Now, what we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at using poetry as an additional material for an response, or basically any area of study that you're covering in year 11 or year 12. Now, poems are basically the simplest form of choice, or the shortest choice that you can use. And even though they're short, obviously they're not going to be simple, but finding the right one will give you a very strong source of supplementary material, and obviously they're going to take a lot less time to read and to respond to. And the one thing about poetry is, even though most people hate it, it's one of those really good choices, and particularly any text that you're going to be using, you're going to have to go into depth, you're going to have to really think critically about it. Now, poetry almost demands that from the outset, and that poetry basically says already that you need to interpret me. I'm not going to just go out and say what I mean. I'm going to require you to interpret. But basically any text is going to do that. A novel will as well. It may not come across on the surface, and certainly you'll be able to read word for word and go, that was easy. But you still need to go through and interpret it. And often poetry is much simpler because it's already asking you to do that. It's already asking you to really investigate what it means and what relevance it has. So you basically already got it, and you already have to interpret it. The work you basically have to do it is significant. However, it does give you less to cover because you can pretty much go through each aspect of the text straight up, and it gives you a very good choice of text that you can use. And even though you might hate it, it's still a very good option to consider. Okay, so things to look for. As with pretty much any other text, find something that's deep. Find a poem which provides a number of techniques and ideas. That would be the first place that you always go to. Make sure it's something that's going to give you something to write about. Something at your level. Now, the thing is that a lot of the poetry that you may study, you may have hated, are ones that probably are not necessarily at your wavelength. They don't speak your language. Not saying necessarily that at your level means something that's simple or not too hard. That's not what I mean at all. What I mean here is basically something you're comfortable writing about, something that you can understand, and you can understand the poet's mindset and the way that they think. So basically someone who you feel that you can relate to, and a poem that you can basically relate to their way of thinking, and basically one you're able to go into depth with. That's what really you should be looking for. Something well known. I mean, try and find a relatively well-known poet, as it will pretty much make finding any resources and any extra materials a lot easier. It's going to give you a lot more in terms of study materials if you are looking for another perspective, or you simply want to look at a few ideas before you really go ahead and interpret it. Then find someone who's relatively well known, because you'll find often a lot of materials for them. And finally, find a poem with insight, something that's going to add really a lot of depth and significance to your area of study. Okay, where to look? Now, Poem Hunter and allpoetry.com is where I go. If I need to find any poem, or if I need to look around for some different poetry to use, I will go straight for those two sites. They have a lot of different poems. Both of them will have rankings for their poems, for their poets, should I say, and a lot of them will include very good ones. All Poetry basically focuses on classic poets. Poem Hunter has a lot more, and will basically rank them. So they have a ranking, I think, out of 500. And it will rank how good they are. Now, a lot of them are on the HSC list, and a lot of them, the sort of top 10, top 20, top 30 are in that HSC list. But a lot of them aren't. So you'll find a lot of different ones, and you'll find a lot of, even some feedback from them in terms of comments. Obviously, you'll rely on them, but they do give you a bit of a guide to start with. And certainly those two sites are very good to start with. Academy of American Poets and also the Poetry Foundation. There are two other sites which do have a lot of other information on poets. They also have information on contemporary poets, which are going to be ones that you're going to find a little bit more difficult to find, particularly on the other sites. Mostly because the first two sites there deal with public domain poetry, which is poets are basically 75 years old or older. So you'll find a lot of classic poets on here, and you'll find a lot of modern poets on here. So if you're looking for something a little bit more modern, these are the two places to look. Of course, as they are, most of them are still in copyright, you will have to purchase the material of those particular poets if you want to use them. Wikipedia is also a very good place to look, just as a starting point, because a lot of poets, basically, if you're looking for information on a poet and their best poems, it will often tell you which ones are their best. And finally, Google. As always, Google poets, poetry, you'll find tons of stuff. And pretty much it's your first port of call. Okay, what to avoid? Now, basically what I mean by community poetry here is there are a lot of sites which allow basically random people, anyone in the world, you can contribute to them, to contribute poetry. The problem with those sites is a lot of the poems that you get may sound very good, but they're not going to be very deep, they're not going to give you a lot of real insight, and a lot of them are from depressive teenagers who want to tell the world about their problems. So in terms of what to start with, community poetry is probably not the best. Children's poetry, probably much for obvious reasons, it can be a bit simplistic. It's not going to give you the kind of depth that you'd be hoping for, and particularly more complex and more abstract poetry is going to give you a lot more than a lot of children's poems will. Shape, haiku, and various other formats. If they are written in those formats, it means that it doesn't necessarily mean they're bad poems, it just means that they have to get attention somehow. And not necessarily saying they have haiku, but haiku is just simply too short. Shape poems are basically trying to find a way of grabbing attention, which means that their ideas are not the most forefront thing at the poet's mind, so avoid anything else like that. I even still get asked whether acrostic poems are relevant and effective. I think you know the answer to that. And anything simplistic. Don't choose a poem because it's simple and you can understand it. Choose one that's going to give you a little bit, challenge you a bit, something you have to interpret. If you don't have to interpret anything, it's not a very good choice. All right. I mean, poetry has to be interpreted. It's why it's there. It's how it uses its language effectively. It's why its economy of language works. So anything simplistic is not going to do that. And it's not going to give you the kinds of ideas and themes and perspectives and abstract ideas that are really going to add any sort of depth to whatever it is you're talking about in your area of study. Okay, but what if you hate it? What if you go, I really hate poetry, I despise it with passion? First of all, don't force yourself to do poetry just because it's the simplest form or because someone tells you to. I mean, what you choose for an additional text is entirely up to you. So if you're really painfully against poetry, basically any benefits of using it are lost if you cannot properly use it. So if you're just using a very simplistic reading because you can't be bothered really going into depth with a poem, then don't bother. Go with something else. Think of why you're using it. As in, think of the reason you could use poetry and why it is you don't like it. Often, I'll get students who come to me and say, I really don't like poetry. And I really don't want to use it. But then I ask, why don't you want to use it? Well, I have to think about it. Well, you can't have to do that with all the texts. So any text you use, you're going to have to think about it. So poetry just gives you less text to think about. So think about it that way. If you're just doing it, basically, you just hate poetry because it requires you to use your brain a bit, then it's probably not the best reason to despise poetry. If you find that you really do despise poetry, though, and really can't force yourself to do it, then don't. And finally, meaning. Don't worry if you can't understand the poem. Poems are meant to be interpretive. They are meant to confuse you. They are meant to be abstract. So if it's a case of you can't understand it word for word and you're worried about it, don't worry about it. The thing you're going to be writing about for an additional text is only going to be a couple of paragraphs. And you're not going to be including a huge amount of techniques anyway. So even if you only understand small sections of the poem, not saying that you would go ahead and use it, but it is still, you are still capable of using it. And while, as I said, it's not the best choice, it is still usable. So don't necessarily worry if you can't get a certain section of it and you don't know what a certain aspect of the poem is about, because most poems are about that. Many people still have debates over meaning of various poets, even many 100 years after they've been written. So don't worry about that too much. Just focus on what you can interpret and what you believe is relevant to your area of study, and leave it at that. Don't worry about it. Okay, some tips. How can you use a poetry effectively? First of all, you look for one that suits your area of study. It's always your priority. Avoid anything on the HSC list. Now, there are a lot of poets on the HSC list. So avoid anything by any of those poets. Find a poem that gives you something to write about. As in, not necessarily the deepest, but one that gives you something that you feel you can write confidently about, that's really going to get to the heart of what your area of study is asking you to use, and what benefit your additional material is going to have. And finally, don't rely on one. Give yourself plenty of options that you can use. So basically, don't just go, oh, well, I've chosen that one, I'm happy with it. Choose a couple of different poems and then settle on one a bit later. Okay, so in summary, look for poetry with depth and insight. That's always your priority for poems you should be looking for. Find the best poem for you. As I said, it is intrinsically up to you what poem you use and why you would use poetry as your additional material. So find something that's right for you. And think about why you would use it, how you can use it, and what's the most effective way you can use it. And that's the same for any text, really. If you're thinking about why and the best reason for you to use it, then you're more likely to find a text that is right. If you're just using it because you're too lazy to find something else, not the best option, and it's not going to give you the required depth or insight or anything else that's really going to add anything to your response. I mean, at the end of the day, you're looking to add something to your response that's going to be different from your prescribed text, and yet still support it in the sense that it helps you to prove whatever point it is you're making, and to make it on a variety of topics. Every area of study you cover is not going to just focus on one thing, it's going to focus on about 3 or 4 things at least. So you need to find something that's going to be able to cover those 3 or 4 things, and be able to do so where you can provide evidence, you can provide insight, you can provide something that's meaningful about them. But otherwise, that's about it for poetry. So until next time, I will see you later.